new cameras coming. You know, it'll be a big boost for us.
That's great.
All right. Welcome to New Hampshire Politics with John Burt. I'm John Burt. I want to thank you for joining us today, and our guest today is Jason Bedrick, and he is the policy analyst at the Cato Institute. Jason, thank you for coming.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Well, I appreciate you coming on, and you're also a former state representative in Windham.
Right.
Also a graduate at Harvard University Kennedy
Kennedy School of Government, yes.
School of Government.
Yes.
And what year did you were you down there for that?
2012. I graduated from the master's program in 2012.
Oh, really? So is it a good program?
It's fantastic.
Yeah.
Not a lot of conservatives or libertarians down there, but
well, that's what I was
high-quality
wondering.
program. Yeah.
So how did you blend in? I mean, did they know who you were?
It was being in the wilderness. You know, the conservatives used to meet in a phone booth down the street.
Yeah. yeah. You must see a lot of stuff down there. You know, it must have been very challenging. Well, I was wondering, you know, for the viewers, so that way they understand, you're with the Cato, you're the policy analyst at the Cato Institute. What is the Cato Institute and what does it do?
Sure. The Cato Institute is a public policy think tank based in Washington, D.C., although they cover issues all across the country. The Cato Institute's mission is to promote individual liberty, free markets, and peace. And I work in the Center for Educational Freedom. So I work on mostly school choice issues and financial transparency.
Oh, well, school choice must be a full-time job.
It is a full-time job, and
Yeah.
it's an exciting time to be working on school choice policy. In the last few years, there have been a plethora of school choice policies adopted around the country. Even Time magazine called 2012, or actually it was 2011, the year of school choice. And then in 2012 and in 2013, we've seen even more programs adopted.
Oh, that's good, and that because I'm a huge supporter of school choice. I really think our children need this. Yeah, and I wrote a few questions down, and one is I was just, you know, what is school choice, and what types of school choice programs are there?
So school choice is sort of an umbrella term that covers a number of different programs, anything ranging from charter schools to vouchers and scholarship tax credit programs like the one that was adopted here last year.
Yeah.
So start with charter schools. New Hampshire has a charter school law, although it's very limited and there are very few charter schools. And I believe you recently had a moratorium on the number of charter schools that could be adopted.
Yes.
Charter schools are publicly funded. They are public schools. They have to be secular. They can't be a religious school. They can only, if there's an oversubscription for a charter school, they have to take students by lottery. They can't choose based on merit or any other characteristics.
Oh.
But they are generally speaking privately managed by either nonprofit or for-profit organizations. Yeah. And they're given a charter that sets out their mission statement and they're exempt from certain rules in the state that traditional public schools would have to adhere to. So that varies, of course, from state to state. Voucher programs are programs where the government collects tax money and then distributes a voucher to individual students to go to private schools, whether religious or secular, the school of their choice. And then scholarship tax credit programs are basically what we have just adopted here in New Hampshire, which is it's not public money, it's private money. Individual donors donate to nonprofit scholarship organizations.
Yes. Yeah.
And then those scholarship organizations fund low-income and middle-income children attending the school of their choice. And the donors receive a tax credit. It varies. In New Hampshire, it's an 85% tax credit, but it varies in other states from about 50% all the way up to 100%.
Oh, so other states have the similar program as we do then?
Yes, there are 12 states that currently have programs in operation, and just this year, Alabama and South Carolina also adopted programs. But there's no real red state, blue state divide on this issue. I mean, there are, you know,
Yes.
states as diverse as Florida, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, Oklahoma, and others have this program.
Wow, yeah, and I think it's a good program. You know, I think it's working well. And now, what's the oldest state that has the same program that we have that's currently in still use? Because we're
Yeah.
fairly new.
Arizona has the oldest scholarship tax credit program, followed by Pennsylvania. The largest two are Pennsylvania and Florida, which both have north of 40,000 students participating in the program.
Wow, really? 40,000?
Yes. And the truth is, the number of students are really constrained because they have caps on the program size. For example, there is one scholarship organization based in Philadelphia called the Children's Scholarship Fund that says that over the last decade, they've had 115,000 applications, but they've only been able to distribute about 15,000 scholarships because of the cap on the program size. So they had 100,000 students on their wait list. In Florida, for this year alone, there were more than 10,000 students that were on the wait list.
Wow.
So New Hampshire has what's called an escalator, as does Florida, which allows the program to grow over time.
Yes, yeah.
Which is very important to allow the supply of scholarships to meet the demand for the scholarships.
Yeah. So the other states, they must not have any trouble finding the funding then.
Well, to meet the cap, the cap is usually hit in most states every single year.
Right.
In Rhode Island, they have a very low cap of only $1 million, which even for that size state is very, very small.
That is.
They hit their cap on the first day every single year because of the number of businesses that are willing to contribute and the number of students that want to participate in the program.
Yeah. And I mean, do you think the other states will, as well as New Hampshire, will expand as they see the success, especially if there's that many children on a wait list?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, over the last several years, you've had a number of states adopt it. 2 states this year, 2 states last year, and a few states the year before. And there are about 10 states that are looking at it for the next year so far. So I think it will happen because not only is it good for the low and middle income children who are able to participate in the program, but they actually find where studies have been done that scholarship tax credit programs can save money because the size of the scholarship is significantly less than what the public schools would otherwise be spending on that student. In New Hampshire, for example, the average scholarship size will be no more than $2,500.
Yes.
But the average per pupil spending in the state of New Hampshire is actually almost $16,000, of which the state contributes about a third of that. So it's significant savings. Florida, a study from their legislative budget office, I forget the name of their, the official name, but they found that Florida saves $1.44 for every dollar in tax revenue that they lose from the tax credit, because they would otherwise be paying for these students. And generally speaking, almost all low-income students go to the public school because they can't afford to go to the private school. Yeah. And so when you have those students switching from the public school to the private school, there's savings, especially when you consider that low-income students qualify for the free and reduced school lunch program. And so those students are actually even more expensive to educate. So this, not only are the students benefiting, but the taxpayers actually benefit from this type of a program.
Wow. Yeah, I didn't even think of that because that would save about a third of the cost just from the state.
Yeah, it's considerable.
Yeah. In $2,500, I've had Kate Baker on here, and she kind of runs that scholarship program. $2,500 to some people could be just enough to get them into that program.
Absolutely. I did a study on the New Hampshire legislation a few years ago for the Josiah Bartlett Center for Public Policy. And if you look in the appendix, we go through and list the published tuition for every single private school in the top 10 most populous cities. And a few of them are actually below that threshold, and most of them offer financial aid, so that the the published figure is it's actually what students actually, or what families actually pay, is less than what we would call the sticker price.
Okay. Yes. Yeah. Well, I know we have the Villa Augustine right here in Goffstown, and they do a great job.
Right, and then again, it's the $2,500 is an average. Other states, some states actually have a set threshold. New Hampshire, I think, wisely decided to go with an average because you may have some families that are, let's say, more middle class, and they just need a little push to afford private school.
Oh, okay.
And so they'll take $1,000.
Yes.
And then you may have some low-income families that need a little more help, so they can get $3,500.
Oh, okay. So that's how, and there must be a formula that, so they'll take how many students they have and then with the amount of money that comes in.
So
divides it up.
we'll see what the Network for Education Opportunity does this year. They're going to be distributing scholarships, I think, within a month or two.
Really? That's going to be real exciting. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, and that's it, is, you know, that was my question. We talked quite a bit about it, but in 2012, New Hampshire did enact a scholarship tax program. You know, and I definitely voted for that. I remember the vote. You know, I just remember that some of the opposition, you know, they didn't want it. And I just don't understand with so many states enacting it, you know, where the opposition comes from.
Well, I think some people feel that it's a threat to the status quo. You know, first, there are some who just don't want people going to religious schools, and then others say that, well, we should be focusing our energies on the public schools. But I don't think that it has to be an either or. I think it's a false choice to say that you can either have school choice or you can have good public schools. As a matter of fact, there was a study from Florida that was paid for by the Florida Department of Education. I think it was Dr. David Figlio from Northwestern University a few years ago. And he showed that in response to Florida's scholarship tax credit program, there was a modest but statistically significant improvement in the academic performance of public school students as a result of the competition. So I think increased competition is good.
Oh, yes.
And I think that, you know, I went to a public school, grades K through 8, and I thrived in the public school. I thrive in a traditional public school classroom, but not all students do. And I think that we shouldn't expect that all students who happen to live in a certain geographical area are going to have their needs met by one school.
Yes.
And you know, even in a given family, you'll find that there are some students that thrive in the public schools, and then there are others who need something else that perhaps a private school can offer. And so what we really want is to move away from the sort of top-down, one-size-fits-all or one-size-fits-few model that we've had ever since the industrial era, and move into the 21st century, you know, the iPod generation, where you can tailor an education to every individual child. I think that's the direction we want to go, and so this scholarship tax credit program helps us get there.
Yeah. Well, and one thing I was surprised on, and I'm not sure if other states do this, but our tax credit, our scholarship program, will allow you to go to another public school if you wish.
Yes, not all of them do that, but you can also go to an out-of-district public school.
Yeah.
And sometimes you may find that the school, the public school in the town over, has some arts program that your school doesn't have, and that better fits your child's needs. So that's, you know, fantastic.
Yeah.
You know, I think that we want to expand, have as many options as you can possibly have. And I think that we will find that schools are more responsive when they don't have a captive audience. Just like, you know, if I was running a pizza joint and, you know, my pizza wasn't too good, well, either they're going to tell me about it or they're going to leave. Now, if I had a captive audience, they could tell me all they wanted, and unless I was a really good or really competent, or both, a good and a competent person and cared for the needs of my customers, I wouldn't have to provide better pizza if I'm the only place they can get pizza. But if there are other options and people leave, well, whether I choose to or not, I mean, if I don't give them that high quality product, they're going to take their business somewhere else. And so I think that's important in terms of the responsiveness of schools.
Yes.
Now, New Hampshire has, for the most part, better schools.
Yes.
And I don't think that's as big a problem here in the state of New Hampshire. But certainly when you look at, let's say, Washington, D.C. or Detroit, or, you know, a lot of the inner city schools, you have a lot of problems with responsiveness to the needs of families, and that's why families are clamoring to get out.
Yes. Well, I heard Louisiana after the flood down there. I heard most of their public schools haven't opened, but a lot of their well, what are those schools?
Charter schools.
The charter schools.
New Orleans has switched to mostly charter schools in the wake of Katrina.
Yeah.
I mean, where they just physically washed out, some of these schools.
And how's that worked on, if you know, with the scores of the student? I mean, has it helped?
So I haven't looked at that data, so I can't say. I know that President Obama's education secretary, Arne Duncan, got himself into a little bit of hot water by saying that Hurricane Katrina was the best thing that ever happened to the to the New Orleans public school district.
Oh.
And he said because it was a really decrepit system and it had lots of problems. Charter schools can be a mixed bag. There was a recent study from Stanford, it's called the Credo study, and they looked at, I don't know how many, they covered most charter schools across the country, and they found that they perform about the same as public schools on average, but there are some real stars, and then there are some that aren't doing quite as well, and actually a good number that aren't doing quite as well, but there was an improvement over the study that they had released a few years ago, which really is the theory behind charter schools. You know, when you have a poor performing public school, it's very hard for political reasons to shut it down or, or to turn it around. Yeah. The idea behind charter schools is that you can close them down. And so the ones that really don't work, you can close down. I had Professor Marty West at the Harvard Graduate School of Education uses a metaphor of marinara sauce.
Oh.
So he says, imagine you had your grandmother's marinara sauce. This has been passed down from generation to generation until it gets to you. You have an emotional attachment to this marinara sauce. You grew up on this sauce. But when you think about it objectively, it's not very good. On a scale of 1 to 10, it's maybe a 3.5. So you have an experiment one afternoon, and you make 10 different marinara sauces, and you change up the different ingredients and the sizes of the ingredients, and you've got more basil in this one, and oregano in that one, and more tomatoes in this one, and you sun-dry the tomatoes over here, whatever you do. And then you try them all out with your family, and you find that, on average, you're at about the same as your grandma's marinara sauce. Quite a few of them are actually worse. And then you've got a few that are much better, a 9 or an 8. So the question is your experiment a failure or a success? And the real answer is, well, it depends what you do next, right? If you continue to replicate the poorly performing schools or the marinara sauce that doesn't taste good, well, then it's a failure. But if you follow the model of the good schools, and, or make the good marinara sauce, then it's a success. Now, to expand the metaphor just a little bit, let's say one of the ones that you think is a 5, your wife thinks is an 8. And another one that you think is a 3, your kids think is a 9. Right? So different sauces are going to appeal to different people. The same thing when you look at the schools, the charter schools in Massachusetts, for example. You have the urban charter schools way outperformed the public school system. Yeah. And when you think about it, the types of families that wanted to go to those schools didn't really have great options when it comes to traditional reading, writing, arithmetic. And so they sent their kids to, these are low-income, mostly minority families, and they're sending their kids to a school where they know that they're going to drill into them the basics and make sure that they go off to college.
Yes. Yeah.
Now, the suburban charter schools actually, on standardized tests, did not perform as well as the suburban public schools. Well, why is that? Well, the suburban public schools are already performing very well. Massachusetts is some of the best schools in the country, depending on which studies you believe. And the type of families that are looking for other options are not the families that are looking for a traditional school program. They want something that's Montessori or Waldorf, that's a little more artsy, where the kids are going to be doing something different, where they're not doing, the drill, the kill and drill over and over. So unsurprisingly, those schools are not performing as well on standardized tests because they're geared to perform well on standardized tests. But you talk to the parents who send their kids to those schools, and they say, hey, I had a fight with my son every single day to get him to go to school when he was in the public school, and now he loves going to school every single day. He loves learning. He's doing all sorts of very interesting hands-on projects. I don't really care about the standardized test. I know that he knows English, he knows math, at his level, and but he loves learning, and that's what's most important. So I think that we really want to expand options for families and let families decide what's best for their own kids when it comes to education.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. Because there are certain kids that just will not blend in.
Right.
But there's alternatives.
And I think there's a justice issue too. I mean, the truth is, in a way, we already have school choice. The market for education right now is called the real estate market. If you can afford an expensive house in an expensive community, then you can go to a good school.
Yes.
Right? If you live in Windham, you live in Bedford, you're going to have a good school. But if you live in some of the poorer towns in the state, you're not necessarily going to have as high quality education if you can't afford to live in those good schools. So, a school choice program helps to level the playing fields. It opens doors for low and middle income families to the different institutions of learning that they otherwise wouldn't be able to afford.
Yeah. Well, when I came from Vermont and I moved over here, I'm from Vermont, and when I moved to New Hampshire, I moved to Woodsville, New Hampshire. Mm-hmm. And at the time, they were the highest per student cost with the lowest test scores. Woodsville really, so I wonder if they would benefit, with a program like this, for school choice.
Like I said, even the higher income areas would benefit in the long run, because first, they are saving on the taxes, and second, it is expanding choices. And even families that live in an area that has a great public school, they it may not be providing what their particular child needs.
Yes, yeah, and we must here in Goffstown must have those kids, that just the public school just doesn't fit.
Right. I mean, we have a zip code based system of assigning kids to schools.
Yeah.
And so we really want to break the ability to buy a big house away from the ability to send your kid to a good school. It's about quality of opportunity.
Well, I like that analogy, is how you said, that if you can afford to live in the good towns, your kids are going to get the better education. So we really do have school choice currently.
Right.
So
just for the wealthy.
Yes. And I like open it up to everybody. Mm-hmm. So this works good. Now, what are I think, with a lot of it we've touched base, but, the benefits of school choice here in New Hampshire, and has there been any research on it?
So, school choice policies have actually been some of the most studied education interventions, in the last century, certainly in the last few decades. There hasn't been a lot of studies on scholarship tax credit programs in particular. There have been a few. The most studied are the charter schools, and especially the vouchers. And the reason for that is that they're centrally managed, and so you can devise the system so that you have a lottery. And it's very important when you are doing research. The gold standard in social science research is called the randomized controlled trial. And the reason for that is, let's say I was comparing the public schools to the private schools. And I would look and I would say, oh, the private school has higher test scores. Therefore, I conclude the private schools do a better job at educating students. Not necessarily, because there was self-selection into the private school. And the private school gets to choose who comes in. So it may be that the real difference is that the private schools chose the students who would anyway perform better, and they didn't add that much value. It's just that they chose students who are already smarter or better performing on standardized tests, which is not necessarily the same thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the way to eliminate all these differences, right? And there may be different, racial or socioeconomic status differences that may account for some or most of the differences in academic performance. So what you do is you want to have some sort of system where they're randomly selected. So anybody that applies for a voucher program, some are going to win a voucher and some are going to lose a voucher randomly. Now, the only difference between Group A and Group B is randomness. All right, so this is sort of based on, medical trials where we're going to take a group of people, we're going to randomly divide them into two different groups. One group we're going to give the treatment, this new experimental drug. The other group we're going to give a placebo. It's just a sugar pill.
Yeah.
And we're not going to tell them. And then we're going to see at the end of the trial if there was a difference. If there's any difference in outcomes between the two groups, because the only difference between the two groups is random, the difference has to be the treatment. So it's the same thing over here. So you have a number of, this is again the gold standard randomized controlled trials of voucher programs and of charter schools, but I'm going to focus on the voucher programs. And they find that the students perform better academically, that they are in safer schools, that they have higher graduation rates, and that they're more likely to go to college. Now again, all of that's on average. It varies from place to place. There were a few studies that found no real difference, but the vast majority, there were no studies that found that vouchers or school choice was negative. There were a few that found that there was no statistical difference, and the vast majority found that there was an improvement in each of these different outcomes.
Wow. Yeah, it makes sense. Yeah, it does. And now on the New Hampshire school choice is heading to the Supreme Court after the ACLU and the American United for Separation of Church and State filed a lawsuit. I mean, it just went through a small lawsuit, and now it's going to the Supreme Court. Where does this stand, and how do you think the outcome's going to be?
Right. So again, the New Hampshire Scholarship Tax Credit Law was enacted. It was passed last year. It was enacted in January, and then immediately the American Civil Liberties Union and Americans United for Separation of Church and State filed a suit saying that it violates the New Hampshire Constitution. They said that there's what's called the Blaine Amendment. It was an anti-Catholic amendment that was added in the late 1800s. At the time, the public schools were de facto Protestant, non-denominational Protestant. Bible was taught in the classroom, and the Catholics said, well, you're teaching a form of Christianity that we don't believe. We can't send our kids to the school and have them learn that, so we're going to set up Catholic schools.
Oh.
And so there was a senator from Maine, I believe his name was James Blaine, and he pushed for an amendment to the U.S. Constitution. It failed, but it was adopted in dozens of states, including New Hampshire. And it said that public money is not allowed to be used at a religious school. So they filed suit saying that this is public money and that it's being used at religious schools, therefore it violates the state constitution. So the judge agreed with them. He upheld the program itself, but he said the money can't be used at religious schools. But they actually, I believe, the plaintiffs and the judge made a number of different mistakes of logic and of misunderstanding the precedent.
Yeah.
First of all, we're not here dealing with public money. Again, the money is a private individual makes a donation to a private nonprofit scholarship organization that funds private families attending private schools. At no point does that money enter the Treasury.
So where is the ACLU and American United saying?
So because they have because there is a tax credit, a partial tax credit, 85%, to the donor, they say, well, that's really now public money. But the U.S. Supreme Court ruled a few years ago in Arizona Christian School Tuition Organization versus WIN. ACSTO v. Wynn in 2011, that it does not constitute public money. Until the money has reached the taxpayer's hand, it does not constitute public money. And in that, the U.S. Supreme Court was echoing a previous decision from Arizona, which also has a Blaine Amendment. And in Arizona, they had ruled likewise, relying on Black's Law Dictionary and tons of precedent, that that money is not public money until the government has actually collected it. Now, to think otherwise, to say that any time the government would be collecting taxes but offers a credit or deduction, that becomes public money, the Supreme Court said that means essentially all money is public money. And it's just a matter of how much the government lets you keep. And
that is true.
Right. But in particular, look at the long-standing tax exemption for nonprofit institutions, including churches and including different religious groups in the state. They have a tax exemption from their property taxes. Does that mean that, well, that money would otherwise be going to the government has decided not to collect it, but we are now, according to Judge Lewis and according to the ACLU, we're now going to call that public money? Or nationwide, anybody that donates to a house of worship receives a charitable tax deduction on their federal income taxes. Well, is that money now public money? Because it would have otherwise been collected as taxes.
That's right.
So that means that every single church in this country, and houses of worship of all religions, are, by that logic, publicly funded, which would seem to violate, at the very least, the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment in the U.S. Constitution and certainly different components of the New Hampshire Constitution. But it doesn't, because in reality, now going back to reality, we have never before held that a tax credit is the equivalent of a government expenditure. Now, even from an accounting point of view, whether the government forgoes $100 in tax revenue or spends $100, that may be the same. But from a constitutional point of view, it's very different. And actually, from a practical point of view, again, if you look at this particular program, when they reduce that revenue, let's say there's a $1,000 contribution, so the government collects $150 and forgoes $850. Don't forget that there's a student somewhere who is now not going to be going to the public school, and so the government is not expending somewhere else. So it's not just simplistic, it's flat out wrong to only look at the revenue side and not also take into account the revenues, the expenditure side.
Yes.
So, but again, the judge also, in addition to just being logically wrong, he got precedent wrong. Now, you don't have to, when a New Hampshire judge is interpreting the New Hampshire Constitution, they often look to the U.S. Supreme Court and they often look to other state courts, but those are not binding. And they look in particular in situations where you don't have a lot of precedent. And in New Hampshire on this particular question, there's actually not a lot of precedent, and it is somewhat mixed. But for example, the Claremont decision years ago, the New Hampshire Supreme Court looked to Massachusetts, which has a very similar constitution. Our constitution was actually based on the Massachusetts Constitution with some very important differences, but they looked to how the Massachusetts Supreme Court interpreted their constitution when deciding how to interpret ours. In this case, the judge looked at the U.S. Supreme Court and sided with the dissent. He looked at the Arizona Supreme Court. He decided with the dissent. He said, well, the U.S. Supreme Court, it was a 5-4 decision. It was really close. Grant Bossy from the Josiah Bartlett Center said, this isn't volleyball. You don't have to win by 2 when it comes to Supreme Court precedent. But he also, when he was looking at the state precedent, I think made a few errors. First of all, when you look at the state precedent, there was a decision back in the 50s. Now, this is a non-binding decision. It's called an opinion of the court. An opinion of the court means the legislature has asked a question of the court gives its opinion, but it's not binding because you don't have the adversarial process where outside groups come and make the strongest arguments on each side, and then the court decides. So it's not binding, but the court said, the court was looking at a program, it was a voucher program for nursing school. And the question was this money, which actually had been collected from, the taxpayer had collected the money, it was in the public treasury, and the legislature is deciding how to dole it out. They say, we're going to give money to students to go to nursing school. Some of them wanted to go to religiously affiliated schools.
Yeah, yeah.
And so now the question is, well, does that violate the Constitution? They said no for 2 reasons. One, this was not directly giving money to a religious school. It was indirect. There was a secular public purpose, which was that we wanted these students to be going to nursing school, and we're giving the money to the students. We're not giving the money to the school. So it's indirect. And second, it's incidental. Nobody is being compelled to go to a religious school. There are many different options. It's not that the only option is religious school. There are lots of different options. And so any money that might eventually make its way to a religious school is only incidental to the choice of the individual. Now, the truth is, years later, there was also a decision that said a $50 property tax credit would violate the New Hampshire Constitution. But again, it's non-binding. Second, I would argue that it misinterpreted the earlier decision. They also tried to apply this same criteria. And really, it's never been fully implemented. Because if it had been fully implemented, this logic, you would have to strike down the property tax exemption.
Yeah, yeah. Well, how about the mortgage, deduction that I get? I save a little bit of money on that mortgage.
Right.
Is that government money after that?
According to the ACLU and perhaps Judge Lewis.
Well, how could he make that ruling when he sees the nurse ruling? Because the nurse ruling makes perfect sense.
Well, he said that first he rejected the idea that he says, look, the only reason that the program exists, the only reason that they're making these donations is because they're getting a tax credit, and so we're going to say that that's public money. And then he just said that, well, it's he didn't buy that it was really indirect. I don't know how. He just sort of hand-waved and said that it's not indirect and it's not incidental.
So how do you think the New Hampshire Supreme Court will rule then?
As the great philosopher Yogi Berra said, it's hard to make predictions, especially about the future.
Yeah.
But I would say that if they're going to adhere to logic and to precedent, that the state Supreme Court is going to rule in favor of the program and uphold it in its entirety.
Yeah.
At the very least, they should.
Now, has it been challenged in other Supreme Courts throughout in other states like Arizona or Florida?
Yeah, so I'll make a comparison. Voucher programs, which do use public money, and it's very clear, have a mixed record. In a number of states, they've been upheld, and then in a minority of states where they exist, they've been struck down, including in Arizona. Scholarship tax credit programs have an undefeated record in the courts. They've never been struck down in a high court yet.
And that's what we have.
And that's what we have, and so New Hampshire would be the first. So again, when you look at Arizona, Arizona said no to vouchers, but then they said yes to scholarship tax credit organizations. And actually, the ACLU has not even bothered to file suit in most states because they knew that they didn't have a case. They filed suit in New Hampshire only because we had some mixed precedent, and in New Hampshire, you're allowed to go judge shopping. So the case was actually not filed in Merrimack Superior Court, where Concord is located, the seat of government. It was filed in Stratford County because they thought they had a better chance there.
Well, that's nice. We need to fix that.
Absolutely.
I can see a bill coming. Well, yeah, because that is going to be exciting to watch because, if it's never been struck down, I hope our Supreme Court justices will look at that.
Well, it's the Institute for Justice that's defending it, and they're the same folks that defended the law before the Arizona and U.S. Supreme Court, so I think that it's in good hands. It's in the best of hands.
Yeah, well, good. And now, another question is, you're going to release a a report soon on financial transparency in education spending. You know, I was curious what you found out and how transparent is New Hampshire education spending data? You know, is it easy for us to see what they're spending?
Right, so nationwide, we'll start with that.
Okay.
There was an interesting statistic. There are, a few years ago, there were 10 different groups that were claiming to be 49th, that their state was 49th in education spending.
Well, 10?
10 different groups that claimed that their state was 49th. And the truth is that several of them were telling the truth. The question is how you count. All right, so if, Education Week has one way of counting, and they adjust for cost of living. The U.S. Census has another way of counting. The National Center for Education Statistics has two different figures they release. One is operating expenses, which omits certain big budget items like buildings. And then they have total per pupil expenditures. And then you've got the NEA, the National Educators Association, which has their own way of counting. So then if you include Washington, D.C. or not in some of these studies, you can actually have a number of states that can claim to be 49th. So there's a lot of confusion out there.
And on the rating, is 49 where you want to be?
No.
Yeah, I was gonna say.
Well, not necessarily. I think that actually the question of spending is not, we want to know as taxpayers how our tax dollars are being spent.
Yes.
But there is no direct correlation between spending and outcomes. Otherwise, Washington, D.C. would have the best schools in the country. Another issue, and this is from the Harvard University's Program in Education Policy and Governance had a study a few years ago that looked at public perception of education policy. And one of the questions they asked was to estimate how much money is being spent per pupil. And that's the most important figure, per pupil, because if I know that one school is spending $1 million, another school is $5 million, another school $10 million, it doesn't really tell me anything unless I know how many students there are. So in order to compare different schools, you need to really look at per pupil. It's not going to give you the complete picture, but it's the best single figure that allows you to compare different schools. And so they asked how much on average how much is your district spending per pupil? The median answer was $2,000. The average answer was about $4,500 per pupil. But in fact, if you look at operating costs, the average that we're spending in the United States is, and this is actually a few years behind because the National Center for Education Statistics always runs a couple years behind. The average is $11,000 per pupil, and we're actually spending around $14,000 per pupil.
Yeah.
Nationwide on average. In New Hampshire, the average is $15,800 per pupil.
Wow.
So when you look at those figures, again, the median was $2,000 on average. The median guess, that's 7 times less than what we're actually spending, $14,000.
So how can they be so far off?
It's a good question because when you look at the last 40 years, the amount we have spent per pupil after we've adjusted for inflation has more than tripled. So we're spending more and more and more, but if you look at test scores, we're actually flat. So one of the problems we believe is that state departments of education are not very good at publishing data. We found 24 states do not publish total per pupil expenditures. They only publish operating per pupil expenditures, which again leaves out those big budget items like buildings and often things like pensions.
Yeah, those are huge.
Yeah, and so in New Hampshire, on our scale, we graded every single state, A to F. New Hampshire came out a D-. And that's because New Hampshire does a great job when it comes to reporting state data, but not such a great job when it comes to reporting district level data. You can only get operating expenditures at the New Hampshire Department of Education website when it comes to districts. You're not able to get the state data. get the total spending picture.
So I can look at the state website or, you know, and get what the state is spending.
Yes,
I
on
can't-
average.
On average, but I can't find out what Bedford, Manchester, you know, all the other towns, Goffstown is spending.
You could look and you could see what the towns are spending. And I'm talking about the total figure, which is which takes into account all sources of revenue.
Yeah.
Right, federal, state, and local. So you could see what's being spent per pupil in terms of day-to-day operations. Okay, but you're not able to see at the district level the total picture that includes how much is being spent on, you know, the buildings, the interest on the debt, and those sorts of items.
Yeah. So how can New Hampshire improve away from the D minus?
Well, either on its own or with a nudge from the legislature, the Department of Education could start releasing that data. I'm assuming that they're collecting it. If they're not, they should be. And if they, you know, if they are, they should be releasing that data to the public. It's very important that people have a complete, accurate picture of how their taxes are being spent. I mean, this is a real, I think, important issue in terms of, you know, if you have a democracy, you know, a constitutional republic, self-government, that is predicated on the idea that citizens are well informed enough to be making public policy decisions.
Yeah.
And we see that this is not the case. When you, again, you look at that Harvard study, they vastly underestimate the amount of money that's being spent. Now, that same Harvard study also asked the question, do you think that we should increase, decrease, or keep about the same how much we're spending on the public schools? And they did another randomized control trial. They had an experiment. They randomly asked respondents either that question,
Yeah.
or they asked first by saying, your district spends X dollars per pupil. Should we increase, decrease, or keep spending about the same? Now, the uninformed group, 2/3 about, said we should increase spending.
Huh.
And the rest said keep it the same or decrease.
Yeah.
When they informed them how much they were spending per pupil and then asked the question, only around 40% said that they wanted to increase spending.
Wow. So it's a big difference.
It's a huge difference, and it goes from an overwhelming majority to a minority, right? So we're not really getting what the taxpayers, what the voters want. Now, case in point, there was the election in Colorado last year in 2012, and there were about 30, I think there were 33 ballot initiatives.
Wow.
That would have raised over $1 billion, $1.03 billion with a B dollars
Wow.
in additional spending on the public schools. And these were ballot initiatives around the state. Right before that, there was an NBC affiliate report that was saying, well, how much money do we spend? There was one woman, she was an activist, and she was filing suit against the state saying that they're not spending enough. And she said they were only spending around $2,000 per pupil. There was somebody from a local think tank that said they were actually spending about the state was spending $10,000 per pupil. They went back to the activist and she said, oh, $10,000, and she laughed. She said, that would be a great problem to have, but it's not the problem we currently have. Now you expect at that point, the reporter is going to tell you, oh, okay, well, here's the real story. Here's how much we're spending.
Yes.
But instead, the reporter says, oh, you know, like all good political debates, this is going to be settled at the polls. Right? Now, but this is not a political question.
No.
Political question is, should we spend more, should we spend less? This is an empirical question. How much are we currently spending? And in fact, they were asking the wrong question. They were asking how much is the state contributing? And that's around $10,000, as the think tank scholar said. But if you look at the National Center for Education Statistics data, which is again a couple years old, they were spending around $12,000 per pupil in Colorado. Now, that doesn't put them at the top, but it certainly doesn't put them at the bottom.
Yeah.
Although there was one group in their state that was claiming to be 49th. They were one of the ones that were not telling the truth. They were using data that was several years old, and they were also adjusting for per capita income. Not cost of living expenditures, per capita income, which is just fraudulent.
Yeah.
But in any case, what happened in that election? You had 31 out of 33 ballot initiatives pass, and they spent 1.01 out of a possible 1.03 billion dollars. Now
Additional dollars.
Additional
Wow.
dollars. Now in a majority of those districts, the ballot initiative passed with less than 60% of the vote, which means that if you look at that Harvard study, you had an electorate that was on average not informed.
Yes.
They were more likely to say yes. But had you informed them, it's possible that in a number, and maybe even all of those districts, you would have a greater number saying no to the increased spending.
Yeah.
So again, spending is not necessarily tied with outcomes. There's a lot of different factors that you have to consider. In some cases, maybe it is important that you spend more. In other cases, not necessarily. The important thing is that we have an informed citizenry that can be making fully formed decisions when it comes to public policy.
Now, how would somebody, the viewers, see the report? And that's coming out shortly.
That
isn't it?
report is going to be it's called Cracking the Books, and it's going to be on the Cato Institute website, which is Cato, CATO.org, and
Yeah.
that's going to be released toward the end of August.
Oh, it will be the end of August. So you
Yes.
must have a lot of work in this.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'll be going on the Cracking the Books tour to talk about this.
And how would anybody get a hold of you? I mean, if they want to, follow you, you have a Twitter account.
Yes, at Jason Bedrick is my Twitter handle. They can
Okay.
also reach me by going on the Cato Institute website, and they can find my email address, jbedrick@cato.org, or they can just reach me through the website itself.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, we've reached the end of the show, and the time just goes by fast. But I'm going to be very interested to see the report, and then also the Supreme Court decision on our current school choice program that we have. When's that going to be in court, do you think?
The appeals were just filed this last week, so I'm not sure. It could be next spring, but I don't know.
Oh, so okay, so there's nothing set in stone right now.
Within the next year, certainly.
Oh,
But the appeals were just filed, so it will be going
Yeah.
up to the state Supreme Court.
but they're going ahead. The program's going ahead, correct?
The program is currently going ahead without giving any money to students going to religious schools, but that could change.
Yeah.
I think that it's, when you look at the program, again, you can choose public school, out-of-district public schools, secular private schools, religious private schools, and actually New Hampshire is the only program in the country that allows some smaller amount of money to be used for homeschooling purposes.
Oh.
So that's really moving us from just school choice, choosing among different school options, to educational choice. I think that's important going forward, is that we broaden the definition of public education.
Yeah. No, I think we got one of the best programs, and I hope the Supreme Court does the right thing. I know the Senate did, because I know our House, controlled by our friends on the Democrats. I voted against it, of course. They wanted to repeal it, and luckily it got to the Senate. And
it's been unfortunate that it's been a partisan issue in New Hampshire, but fortunately it's been a bipartisan issue in a number of other states. There's a group, Democrats for Education Reform, that has been a champion of these laws. Some national figures as well. When you look at Cory Booker, who's probably going to be the next Democratic senator from New Jersey, and then the programs over time, just like a few decades ago, charter schools were considered a right-wing, fringe idea. It's now almost left-wing. And so that changes over time. And when you look at the states, Florida, Georgia, Arizona, Pennsylvania, Oklahoma, and I'm probably missing a couple, that have expanded their programs since the program has been enacted, they've had overwhelming bipartisan majorities.
Wow.
So in a few states, it's actually been unanimous, expanding the program. So I think, I hope and I expect, based on precedent from other states, that one day, even in New Hampshire, it's going to be a bipartisan issue.
Yes, I believe it will be. You know, I think once the program gets moving, I think both sides will look at it and then, you know, favorably. I really do believe that. Well, Jason, I want to thank you for coming on. And,
Thank you for having me.
You know, I appreciate you taking your time and, you know, stopping over here because I know you got a very busy schedule.
Oh, my pleasure.
You know, especially with this report, you got to be working day and night on
And
this.
if people want to see me, I don't know
yeah.
when this is airing actually, but I'm going to be at the Milton Friedman Legacy Day breakfast with the Americans for Prosperity of New Hampshire. So I'm sure you can go to their website and look it up. That's on July 31st
Okay.
At 7 or 7:30 a.m. I should find out before I show up.
Yes.
In Manchester.
Yeah. All right. No, that's great. Yeah, they can check that out. And again, this is John Burt, New Hampshire Politics with John Burt. I want to thank you for watching. We had Jason Bedrick, and he's the policy analyst at the Cato Institute down in Washington, D.C. And until next time, I want to thank you for staying with us and have a good day. Bye now.